Close the door. Lock it. What I'm about to tell you was never meant to survive the walls of that church. It started with the screams, not loud ones, not obvious, the kind that stretched through floorboards in the dead of night, soft, muffled as if the walls themselves were trying to forget. Cedar Creek, Indiana, 1878, a town of piety, industry, and secret so well buried, even God stopped looking. They called it First Methodist, a church built on limestone and lies, twin bell towers rising like watchmen, warning you away rather than calling you in. Behind its Gothic windows they built a factory, not for faith, not for salvation, but for disappearance. 60 children, gone, erased, their names written in Sunday school attendance books, but absent from every dinner table, every birthday, every graduation, vanished not all at once, but slowly, quietly, strategically, like inventory being moved, like cattle selected. And yet, no posters, no investigations, no outrage, only silence, the kind of silence money buys, the kind that thrives when morality wears a collar and speaks from a pulpit. Margaret Wilson, Sarah Coleman, two women cloaked in religious respectability, beloved teachers, revered mentors, architects of an operation so depraved, its precision almost defied belief. But they weren't the head, no. That belonged to Robert Hayes, coal baron, church elder, devout manipulator. A man who didn't just fund the church, he weaponized it. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a tragedy. This was commerce. They told parents their children had been chosen, handpicked for God's work. They called it an excursion. They called it an honor. And those parents, hungry for hope, blinded by the church's light, they believed it. They let go of their sons and daughters with trembling hands and whispered prayers, never knowing they'd already been sold. By the time anyone asked questions, the trail was cold, too cold, and those who asked too loudly, well, they didn't stay long in Cedar Creek. You weren't meant to hear this, but you're here now, and something inside you knows. This isn't just history, it's a pattern, a blueprint, one they still use. This is your first step down where light doesn't reach, down where the choir sang to cover cries for help. The bells of Cedar Creek still ring. But if you listen closely, they echo with names never spoken again. They called her Miss Margaret. Hair pinned so tightly it looked like it hurt to smile, though she rarely did. The children respected her, some even loved her, but most feared her. Not because she was cruel, but because she saw through them. She could name your sin before you confessed it. She could quiet a room with a glance. But what no one understood, not the children, not the parents, not even the elders, was that Margaret Wilson wasn't leading a Sunday school. She was conducting a harvest. She came to Cedar Creek in 1871, just months after the railroad came through, transforming farmland into coal fields and God into profit. She was educated, polite, well recommended by Philadelphia's Methodist elite. A savior, they said, for the town's spiritual education. What she was a scout. Margaret didn't see children the way other people did. She saw assets, prospects, flesh with futures that could be rerouted, exploited, erased. She understood systems, especially the way religious institutions protect their own. The power of paperwork, the camouflage of piety. She knew how to disappear someone by drowning them in legitimacy. Attendance ledgers, progress reports, forged letters from missions in distant states. It was all a stage play, and Margaret was the playwright. But even a playwright needs a muse. Enter Sarah Coleman. If Margaret was the architect, Sarah was the siren. Gentle, soft-spoken, maternal. Her kindness was real, but it was twisted. She believed she was saving these children from poverty, from sin, from their families. She whispered to them that their lives had purpose, that they were special, chosen. And when they vanished, she cried. But not because they were gone. She cried because they were finally where they belonged. And all the while the congregation cheered, because the pews were full. The collection plates overflowed. Children were learning scripture. And those few who left, well, they were the lucky ones, weren't they? Off to missionary work, off to study ancient texts, off to serve God in ways small-town Indiana couldn't understand. That's how it starts always. Not with chains, not with cages, but with good intentions, and the wrong people trusted to fulfill them. You feel it, don't you? That hollow place in your gut, that pull in your chest, that part of you that senses this is bigger than Cedar Creek. Because it is. You were never meant to know what Margaret Wilson knew. But now you do, and the descent has only just begun. Say the words in the comments. No child vanishes in silence. Say it twice, lock it in, let them know you're watching now. By spring of 1877, 8 children had vanished, but no one called them missing, not out loud, not in church, not in town meetings. You have to understand, Cedar Creek wasn't a place where people asked questions. It was a place where people obeyed, where God came first, and God, they were told, had a plan. But the plan was written by men like Robert Hayes. Hayes wasn't a pastor. He wasn't even especially devout, but he was useful to the church, a pillar of the community, owner of 3 mines, 2 grain elevators, and the general store where nearly every family bought their flour, sugar, and medicine. He controlled supply, wages, housing, and the church's future. He didn't preach sermons. He funded them. So when Hayes appointed Margaret Wilson as head of the Sunday school program, no one objected. When he donated funds for the new educational wing, everyone cheered. And when he announced the children's educational excursions to distant states, parents wept with gratitude. Because in a town where dreams ended in coal dust and broken backs, this was hope. But Robert Hayes didn't deal in hope. He dealt in flesh. You see, the Midwest was expanding, and expansion needs labor. Small hands for spinning wheels, narrow bodies for mine shafts, soft voices for house service. Children were currency, and Cedar Creek had an abundant supply. Hayes had connections, underground buyers, factory owners, brothels that didn't care about age. And through Margaret and Sarah, he had a pipeline. Clean, quiet, holy, wrapped in scripture and Sunday best. Every excursion was a shipment. But here's the brilliance, the horror. Parents were made to believe they'd been blessed. Their children were chosen. That word again, always chosen. For missions, for scholarships, for divine work beyond the reach of poor Indiana lives. And those who stayed behind, they envied the ones who left. That's how you silence an entire town. You make them want the lie. You make them pray for it. And when the letters stopped coming, when visits didn't happen, when birthdays passed without word, Margaret had answers. Always logical, always scriptural. God was testing their faith. Mission work was consuming. Travel was difficult. And the parents, tired, indebted, ashamed to question holiness, they accepted it. But not everyone did. Because one substitute teacher, brought in on a cold December morning, saw something beneath the chapel floor that made her scream. And that scream should have shattered the town's silence. But it didn't. Her name was Ellen Hartwell. 29 years old, unmarried, sharp-minded in a way that unsettled the men of Cedar Creek. She was brought in after Margaret Wilson fell ill with what the elders called winter affliction. One Sunday, one temporary assignment. That's all it was meant to be. But Ellen noticed things. The way the children's attendance list had gaps. Names she'd never heard spoken aloud. The way the other teachers exchanged glances when she asked about certain students. The locked cabinet in the back of the classroom, the one with ledgers that didn't match the roster. A girl named Ruthie, who sat alone, never smiled, and whispered one phrase to Ellen that stuck like a thorn. The floor eats the bad ones. It would have been easy to ignore, to smile politely and finish her day. But Ellen Hartwell wasn't like the others. She'd been raised in Boston, schooled by women who taught her that silence in the face of corruption was a sin worse than blasphemy. So when the children were dismissed, she stayed behind, and as the bells of First Methodist rang through the gray December sky, she descended into the church's lower level, the basement expansion that Hayes had funded the year before. It was supposed to be storage. Books, instruments, holiday decorations. But what she found wasn't storage. It was staging. 3 rooms, each locked. One contained neatly folded children's clothing, dresses, boots, undergarments, all sizes, some with names still stitched into the collars. Another held crates of dried food, water barrels, and a shelf of medical supplies arranged with surgical precision. But the third room was different. It smelled of iron and rot. Its floor was stained, the kind of stains that no sermon could explain. And along the back wall, beneath a wooden platform that had once supported a pulpit, were 6 small wooden compartments. Child-sized, she opened one. Inside was a name tag, Joseph P., mission-bound. There was no Joseph on the current roll. That night Ellen tried to tell the elders, but they silenced her, quickly, respectfully. They thanked her for her service and assured her the matter would be handled internally. By morning, her boarding house had been paid through spring, and she was gone. But not before she left a letter, a warning, a plea, and one copy of the ledger she'd found, hidden beneath the chapel floorboards. It listed 60 names, 60 children, all marked departed, and none had ever come home. Ellen's letter never reached the sheriff. It reached a mailbox that emptied into a locked drawer in Robert Hayes's office, one of many drawers where dissent went to die. Still, rumors bled. A miner's wife whispered about the locked rooms. A shopkeeper mentioned children's clothes sold for pennies in the next county. Quiet ripples in stagnant water, and ripples, given time, grow teeth. Hayes doubled down. Sunday sermons thundered with warnings against gossip. Margaret returned to the pulpit pale but resolute, her illness a convenient veil. She spoke of spiritual warfare, of Satan stoking suspicion among the faithful. She told parents to guard their tongues lest they become instruments of darkness. Guilt is a perfect leash. The more they doubted, the tighter it pulled. Inside the basement, the operation evolved. Wooden compartments were replaced by iron cages shipped from Chicago slaughterhouses, easier to clean, harder to splinter. Sarah, ever gentle, introduced night prayers, whispered hymns sung to drown the rattle of chains. She taught the children to harmonize, to transform terror into chorus. Upstairs, congregants marveled at angelic echoes, rising through the vents, never knowing those voices were begging. Melodies disguised as worship. Transportation routes expanded east toward Pittsburgh's mills and west to St. Louis' brothels. Each shipment logged in ledgers written twice, one for church archives, pure and philanthropic, one for buyers, coded in Greek letters. Ellen had stolen only a page of the second ledger. There were volumes, but cracks widened. A railroad porter noticed crates billed as mission supplies, shifting too much weight inside, soft thuds, muffled sobs. He asked questions. He lost his job the next day. A visiting circuit preacher smelled iron in the sacristy and asked to see the storeroom. Hayes mistook him for a papist spy and had him escorted out of town at gunpoint. Yet every act of suppression birthed new whispers, and whispers breed witnesses. Then, April 3, 1877, a fire in the North Mine collapsed a tunnel. 10 men died, dozens injured. Amid the chaos, a charred ledger fell from Hayes's pocket as he directed rescue efforts. A foreman retrieved it. The cover read Blessed Excursions 1877. Inside 60 names, ages, purchase prices, destinations. A final column, condition, deliverable. That foreman could have burned the book. He could have sold it back to Hayes and bought his own mercies. Instead, he wrapped it in oilskin, tucked it beneath his coat, and carried it into the dusk. Toward truth, toward danger, toward the one place secrets fear open air. He was a quiet man. A foreman with soot-stained hands and tired eyes. His name was Thomas Ellaby, and he wasn't known for bravery, until the day he crossed a line no man in Cedar Creek had ever dared cross. He read the ledger, every name, every detail, price, age, destination, even behavioral notes, like eager to please. Doesn't speak English, or worse, Hung claimed. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't misrecorded. It was a menu. And Thomas understood something that chilled his bones. His own daughter's name was on it. Lydia Ellaby, age 11. Departed pending. She hadn't been selected yet, but she was on the list. He couldn't sleep that night. Couldn't breathe right. He sat in his home, shaking, while his wife prayed at the table. Prayed for strength, for clarity, for protection they never truly had. Cedar Creek had always felt off, but now it was exposed. And exposure, he realized, was death. The next morning, he did something reckless. He took the ledger to the only person in town who might still have a conscience and power, Judge Franklin Dean, a man whose name carried weight, whose family had held sway since before the war, a man who sat in the front pew of First Methodist every Sunday. Thomas placed the ledger on Dean's desk without a word, just opened it, watched the judge's face go pale, then hard. Silence. "You know what happens if this gets out," Dean said flatly. "You'll bring down the entire town." Thomas didn't flinch. Maybe it deserves to fall. Another silence. Then the judge rose, walked to the fireplace, and threw the ledger in. The flames devoured the evidence. But Thomas wasn't broken, because what he'd seen couldn't be unseen. And what he'd lost, trust, safety, faith, was gone already. He didn't speak of it again, not publicly, but he acted, quietly. Lydia never returned to Sunday school. The family pulled back from town life, moved out by summer, but before he left, he did one final thing. He copied the names, all 60, by hand, and in the margins, he scribbled the words, "These are the stolen. If I vanish, find them." He sent one copy to his cousin in Illinois, another to a war buddy turned reporter in Chicago. The third, he buried in a metal box beneath the church's back steps. A seed of truth, planted in cursed soil. Cedar Creek didn't implode. Not yet, not publicly. Towns like that don't collapse in fire, they rot in silence. The facade stayed clean, the hymn still rang. But under the surface something had changed, a vibration, a sickness. The kind of invisible infection that spreads from eye contact, from side glances, from the way a woman clutches her child's hand tighter on the way to Sunday school. Because now a few knew, not just Ellen, not just Thomas, but others. And once you know, you can't pray the knowledge away. Margaret Wilson felt it, in the quiet hallways, in the way fewer parents volunteered, in the subtle way certain families stopped making eye contact at service. She was no longer running a program. She was managing an illusion, and illusions, no matter how pious, crack. So she did what predators always do when exposed. She accelerated. Between May and August of 1877, 18 more children were taken. The letters stopped. The excuses stopped. Even the talk of missions and education grew thin. The vanishings became quicker, colder, more industrial. Children were called in one by one. Some left with chaperones, others with nothing but a bag and a prayer. One child, 10-year-old Jonah Briggs, fought, bit Margaret Wilson on the hand, screamed for his mother. The next day Margaret appeared in the pulpit, bandaged and smiling. Jonah, she said, had been called early, a special opportunity in St. Louis. No one believed her, but no one challenged her either, because Robert Hayes made it clear questions had consequences. A railroad worker who asked about train manifests lost his home in a clerical error. A grieving mother found her husband fired from the mine the same week she refused to sign a release form. Another woman, pregnant, told a neighbor she suspected the church was hiding something. She was found dead 3 days later. The coroner ruled it spontaneous miscarriage complicated by hysteria. No investigation followed. This is how evil stays alive. It doesn't wear horns. It wears suits and crosses. It uses God's name as a mask and the threat of damnation as a leash. But it wasn't enough, because Ellen Hartwell, long gone from town, wasn't done. She had mailed copies of her notes to more than one person, and in a cold newsroom in Chicago, a reporter unfolded those pages like a priest opening a sealed confession. He didn't blink. He lit a cigarette, and he whispered, "We're printing every word." Chicago, November 1877. The city was already a powder keg. Labor strikes, corrupt politicians, streets choked with smoke and soot. But when the Tribune ran a front-page story titled, 60 Children Lost, the Sunday School Disappearances of Cedar Creek, it didn't just spark outrage. It split the soul of the Midwest. The article was brutal. Names, dates, quotes from Ellen Hartwell's letter, excerpts from Thomas Ellaby's scribbled notes, even a grainy sketch of First Methodist Twin Towers, captioned, "The Temple of the Vanished." The reporter, Julian Archer, didn't mince words. He accused the church of human trafficking, of conspiracy, of state-wide corruption, and of using religion as a laundering system for stolen lives. The nation didn't know what to do with it. One side screamed blasphemy, demanded retractions, burned copies of the paper in front of churches. The other side, fathers, mothers, Civil War veterans who'd buried too many sons, demanded blood. Suddenly, Cedar Creek had visitors, strangers asking questions in stores, lawyers requesting school records, journalists pretending to be congregants, and, eventually, a federal investigator, quietly dispatched under pressure from a senator whose own niece had vanished on a biblical field trip 3 years prior. Inside First Methodist, the panic began. Margaret Wilson, for the first time in her life, looked uncertain. Her sermons grew frantic. Sarah Coleman stopped attending public functions. Robert Hayes shifted money between accounts and signed over partial mine ownership to a cousin out of state. The walls were cracking, but the town still resisted. Even with national eyes watching, even as the press circled like vultures, Cedar Creek closed ranks. Because shame is stronger than justice. Because to admit their church had become a meat grinder for innocence meant admitting they let it happen. Some parents still refused to believe. They clung to Margaret's version. They told themselves their children were abroad, doing mission work, learning scripture in far-off places. They recited it like liturgy, even as the letters stopped, even as birthdays passed, even as bedrooms gathered dust. One mother carved, Proverbs 3:5, into her front door. "Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not unto thine own understanding." She repeated it every day, instead of asking where her daughter Emily had gone. But the headlines had teeth. The whispers had turned into fists pounding on the doors of churches across Indiana. And back in Chicago, Julian Archer received an envelope. No return address, just a photograph, faded and gray. 6 children, shackled, crying. A sign behind them, property of Zion's Light Freight. Zion's Light wasn't a church. It was a logistics company, and it had just signed a contract with First Methodist. He arrived under the name John Samuelson, but that wasn't his real name. He carried no Bible, wore no cross, and asked no blessing when he stepped inside Cedar Creek. He wasn't there for salvation. He was there to audit the soul of a town. Officially, he was a rail inspector, investigating freight irregularities linked to Zion's Light logistics. But unofficially, he was a federal investigator for the U.S. Postal Inspection Service. The crime wasn't just child trafficking. It was mail fraud, interstate conspiracy, and the misuse of federal transport channels. That made it Washington's business. John didn't walk with a badge. He walked with questions. Quiet ones, surgical. He began at the depot, asked about crates shipped with no weight records, asked about destinations that didn't exist. Then he walked the edge of town, coal camps, boarding houses, the railroad junction, asking if anyone remembered children leaving in groups. Some shrugged, some changed the subject. One old woman said, "You mean the blessed ones? Yeah, they left. With God, I hope." But John wasn't hoping. He was hunting. When he attended First Methodist, he sat in the back, took notes during Margaret Wilson's sermon, marked the tremble in her voice, the way she avoided the words, children, and excursions. He noticed that Sarah Coleman never appeared, that Robert Hayes refused communion, citing illness. John saw everything. He also saw the locks on the basement doors. Industrial, fresh. He requested a tour of the church's educational wing, citing interest in its progressive design. He was denied, politely, but firmly. Margaret said the area was undergoing renovations. He smiled, thanked her. And that night, he returned, alone. He picked the side door lock like peeling fruit, moved silently through the hallways, a dull lantern wrapped in cloth to hide the glow, down the stairs, into the belly of the beast. What he found wasn't just criminal. It was biblical in its cruelty. 3 cages, rusted but still bolted to the floor shackles, a wooden board with tally marks, a child's sandal, blood darkened into the grain of the walls, and in a corner, under a dusty blue tarp, a crate marked for Zion's Light Freight. Inside 6 Bibles, 2 dolls, and a shipping manifest listing. Number of pieces 7. Only 6 items were in the box. When John emerged, he was shaking. He didn't pray. He lit a cigarette with trembling hands and whispered, "This is not a church. It's a warehouse for the damned." He wired Washington the next morning. But in Cedar Creek the walls had ears, and within hours of his report being sent, the first body was found. A station agent, throat slit, ledger burned beside him. The message was clear. Truth has a price. By the morning of December 3rd, 1877, Cedar Creek was no longer a town. It was a stage set for something ancient and unspeakable. The kind of darkness that doesn't arrive with thunder, but seeps in like damp rot under floorboards. The town woke to blood, and no one said the word murder. They said accident, robbery, God's mysterious hand. But John Samuelson knew better. The rail station agent had been the first to speak openly. Quietly to John, off the record. "They're loading crates in the dark," he said. "Children ain't supposed to be that still." That man bled out behind the depot with his tongue removed. Not a warning, a message. John didn't leave town. He became colder, sharper. He slept with his revolver under the pillow and started carrying a Bible, not for comfort, but as a disguise. He showed up to Sunday service, shook hands with Margaret Wilson, and told her, "The sermon stirred something in me." She smiled, but her eyes, they blinked wrong, too fast, too rehearsed. That same night Sarah Coleman vanished, not on a mission, not called away, just gone. Her belongings still in her room, her clothes laid out for the next day, a teacup half full on the nightstand. The elders told the congregation she had left to tend to her dying sister in Michigan. She had no sister, but someone had cleaned her room, scrubbed it raw, and behind the dresser, John found a single page, torn from a child's Bible. One phrase circled in charcoal, "Suffer the little children to come unto me." Below it, in shaking handwriting, "They're not coming to him, they're going to them." That page would become the cornerstone of the official report. But the town never saw the report, because the report never made it out. That week, The telegraph lines from Cedar Creek malfunctioned. The railroad depot suspended freight due to weather damage. Even the roads in and out of town were mysteriously blocked by fallen timber, washed-out bridges, deliberate inconveniences designed to trap one man inside a tightening throat of secrecy. John knew he had one shot. He gathered what he could. Evidence, witness names, photographs, manifests, and prepared to leave on foot. 40 miles through snow and mud to the nearest town with a working line. But someone else had plans. At 2:11 a.m., the church bell rang. No one was scheduled to ring it. And when John stepped outside his room, he saw the flame. First Methodist was on fire. A blaze too fast, too clean, too convenient. And just before the smoke swallowed the sky, he saw movement on the roof. A figure, long coat, holding a bundle. It was Margaret Wilson, and the bundle, small, still, too small to be anything but a child. The fire didn't just consume the church. It devoured the evidence, the cages, the crates, the basement ledgers, the blood-soaked wood. All of it turned to smoke. By dawn, First Methodist was a blackened skeleton framed against a gray Indiana sky. The town gathered like mourners at a funeral they couldn't name. No one asked why there had been no alarm, no fire brigade, no rescue attempt. They stood in silence as if something sacred had passed. But John Samuelson wasn't among them. He was lying in a ditch outside town, blood frozen to his collar, ribs cracked. They'd come for him as the fire began, 3 men with cold dust in their hair and rope in their hands. They thought they killed him, thought a blow to the skull and a prayer over his body would be enough. They didn't know who they were dealing with. John crawled a quarter mile in darkness, dragged himself to a hunting cabin he'd scouted on his second week. There, between blackouts, he wrote, not an official report, a warning, a confession, a map. The church was the storefront. The freight was human. The buyers were not strangers. They were churchmen, businessmen, judges. They sat in pews while the floorboards whispered beneath them. He described the cages, the manifest, the Zion's Light contract. He named names, Hayes, Wilson, Coleman, and others, the silent partners who never touched a child but financed every crate. He ended it with a sentence burned into history. This wasn't a crime. It was a ritual, and the ritual isn't over. He sealed the pages in waxed linen, placed them inside a tobacco tin, and buried it under the stone marker behind the cabin, an old gravestone, weathered and nameless, just across in the year 1812. That document would remain hidden for 61 years. Back in Cedar Creek, they held a service among the ashes. No bodies were recovered. Margaret Wilson, they said, perished bravely in the blaze, trying to save beloved students. Sarah Coleman was canonized in absentia. Robert Hayes donated land for a new chapel. Forgiveness was preached. Questions were shamed. But something had changed. The church never rebuilt. The Sunday school was quietly dissolved. Families moved away. The rail line shut down. Cedar Creek began to vanish. Like the children it had consumed. But not everyone forgot. In Chicago, Julian Archer, now branded a heretic, blackballed from every major paper, began writing letters of his own. He collected stories, tracked names, waited. Because he believed what John had written, the ritual isn't over. And in 1938, a boy hiking near the old hunting cabin kicked a stone loose, found the tin, and opened a door no one was ready to walk through. The boy's name was Daniel Hargrove. 13 years old, his family was passing through what was left of Cedar Creek, now a ghost stitched together by rust and whispers. They camped near the old hunting trails, looking for deer or relics. Daniel, bored and restless, wandered beyond the map. That's when he found it, a crooked gravestone no one remembered, bearing no name, just a cross and the year 1812. He kicked it out of frustration, and the ground beneath it sank. Daniel dug, half out of curiosity, half out of some instinct he didn't understand. 2 feet down, his fingers struck metal, a tin box. Inside, waxcloth, yellowed pages, and a note on top in shaky cursive. If you found this, it's your turn to see what they buried. He read the first line of John Samuelson's letter and ran back to camp, heart pounding like it belonged to someone being hunted. By the next week, the letter was in the hands of a history teacher in Indianapolis. By the next month, it reached the basement of a local radio station, and by the next year, it became the obsession of one man, Arthur M. Bell, an amateur historian with a military background and deep distrust of religious institutions. He published a pamphlet titled The Cedar Creek Protocol, 60 Names, One Church, and the Ritual of Disappearance. It spread like a virus, quietly, violently, passed hand to hand in bars, gun clubs, secret reading groups, and fringe veteran circles. By 1940, it had been copied hundreds of times. The authorities called it conspiracy trash, but the men reading it, they started asking questions. What if this wasn't a one-time horror? What if Cedar Creek was a model? A template for systems that still operate, just under different names? Arthur Bell began cross-referencing disappearances from church-run programs across the Midwest. Baptist, Catholic, Protestant. Between 1870 and 1910, he found 4 or 12 children recorded as missing or transferred under similar circumstances. Most from poor families, most under church care, almost none investigated. He proposed a theory that shattered even hardened readers. What if these weren't individual crimes, but the continuation of an old system? What if these disappearances were the natural byproduct of a religious economy built not on salvation, but on control, supply, and silence? Bell was laughed off academic stages. Then, in 1943, he disappeared himself. His manuscript, The Hidden Church, was confiscated in an alleged FBI raid and never recovered. But fragments survived, and those fragments found their way into modern cult investigations, military intelligence briefings, and one CIA document labeled OPRDO, SUNDOW, Unauthorized Civilian Reporting Religious Disappearances, 1870-1939. Cedar Creek wasn't buried. It was filed, and the system, it adapted. What began as a backwoods church scandal evolved into something systemic, embedded not in towns, but in structures, in hierarchies, in budgets, in programs that wore the face of compassion while operating like mechanisms of extraction. By the 1950s, the Sunday school disappearances were labeled urban legend, a cautionary tale whispered among paranoid veterans and fringe historians. But the pattern was never broken. It was simply modernized. Church-run youth retreats became federally funded. Foster care networks expanded under the promise of safety. Religious orphanages rebranded as family services. The face changed, the system remained. You want numbers? Between 1946 and 1979, over 76,000 children passed through faith-based educational excursions across North America. Programs operated by organizations with direct ties to Zion Logistics, which still existed. Now a humanitarian supply chain solutions firm. Their headquarters, just 13 miles from the burned remains of Cedar Creek. Still think this was just a one-time crime? Still believe the ritual ended in fire? Let's talk contracts. Zion was awarded state-level logistics deals for transporting food and materials to remote religious schools in Appalachia, the Ozarks, and the Dakotas. But audits showed consistent overreporting of delivered materials and underreporting of student travel. Some facilities claimed to house 200 children, but school photographs never showed more than 80. Where were the rest? No answer. Just red tape, shredded files, lost during a merger. This isn't about religion. It's about what religion can become when twisted by power, because control is older than scripture. And in 1961, a whistleblower named Clara Devine, a former records clerk for the Baptist Education Alliance, sent an anonymous letter to the Denver Times. It contained 6 pages of internal memos detailing child relocation initiatives between churches in 5 states. The memo didn't call it trafficking. It called it spiritual displacement for the purpose of kingdom utility. Let that sink in. Kingdom utility. They weren't stealing children. They were assigning them. After Clara's letter leaked, she vanished. No obituary. No missing persons report. Just a note scrawled in her handwriting mailed to her sister 2 weeks later. It's still happening. Cedar Creek never burned down. It just changed zip codes. And here's where it gets worse. Every major religious abuse scandal of the 20th century, from the School for the Destitute in Ontario to the Florida Industrial School for Boys, carries a thread, a financial trail, a shared philosophy, and buried in each, a name. Margaret Wilson. Not the same woman, of course, but aliases, variants. Wilson as headmistress, Wilson as director, Wilson as donor. A myth, a symbol, or a lineage? What if Margaret Wilson wasn't a person, but a role? A title passed down like vestments? What if the ritual didn't die because it was never meant to? If you think the ritual died with Margaret Wilson, you've misunderstood the nature of power. Power doesn't burn. It mutates. It puts on new clothes, updates its language, gets a public relations team. In the modern world, control doesn't wear a black veil. It wears a grant proposal, a 501c3 number, a mission statement. Let's talk about the Children's Horizon Foundation. You've probably seen their commercials, smiling pastors holding orphan children in disaster zones, promising food, education, and faith. They claim to rescue thousands from poverty and place them into spiritually aligned homes. Their funding, multi-denominational, evangelicals, Catholics, even corporate donors like Zion Human Logistics Group, a successor to the original Zion's Light Freight. Sound familiar? Dig deeper. Their board includes at least 4 individuals who were formerly involved with youth religious programs shut down in the 1980s for disciplinary irregularities. Their child placement database isn't publicly accessible. Their annual reports list thousands of relocated children, but no names, no case studies, no photos, no follow-ups, just numbers. In 2014, a journalist named Elena Masters tried to track 20 graduates of the Horizon program in Arkansas. None of them existed. Not in schools, not in churches, not in the foster system. Just names on paper attached to successful missions. Helena was doxxed, fired. Her editor disappeared. 2 months later, her car exploded in an alley in Tulsa. No charges filed. Her research vanished. That was the warning shot. Now consider this: every time a Horizon facility was investigated, a new Margaret Wilson appeared. Not with that name, but with her profile: middle-aged, unmarried, devout, respected, described as mother to all. And always, without fail, the children closest to her disappeared before the program was shut down. Pattern or blueprint? Still not convinced. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services 2019 internal audit found over 3,000 unaccounted for children in faith-affiliated shelter programs operating under federal immigration contracts. Lost in transition, reassigned, transferred, no records, no follow-up. And the contractors behind those programs: Zion Integrated Response Logistics, new name, old soul. But here's what most will never admit: this isn't just a scandal. It's a philosophy. The idea that some children are born to be used, moved like inventory, reshaped in the name of God, country, or profit. It's Cedar Creek's original sin, scaled to a global level and sanitized for modern sensibilities. We want to believe monsters live in shadows, but in reality they live on boards of trustees. They pray louder than anyone else. They smile for cameras, and they count the children in units, not names. Because when a system is built to extract and silence, the question isn't how did this happen. The real question is how deep does it go? You've seen the surface, the children, the disappearances, the false sanctuaries. But systems this intricate don't run on ideology alone. They run on capital, quiet, old, untouchable capital. Let's name the architects. In 1978, a declassified financial intelligence report, buried for decades under the name Project Asphodel, mapped connections between religious child welfare programs and private banking institutions. Not local credit unions. We're talking multi-generational wealth families with no public-facing religious affiliations. Why would they fund Sunday schools, orphanages, and spiritual education programs? Because these weren't charitable endeavors. They were supply chains. Children weren't saved. They were categorized by obedience, physicality, linguistic skill, bloodline. Each one labeled and sorted through an international web of benevolent programs. From Cedar Creek to Johannesburg, from the Ozarks to the Vatican's own orphan charities. The same back-end appeared again and again: Zion Logistics, the Horizon Trust, Orbis Children's Alliance, all sanitized names for what one investigator called spiritual outsourcing. At the financial apex sat the Lauren Family Consortium, a Swiss, Liechtenstein dynasty that had funded religious infrastructure since the early 1800s: churches, missions, schools, but always with a hidden clause: rights to educational outcome audits. In plain English, they didn't just fund the institutions. They had access to the children. Records uncovered in 1996 during The Hague listed over 400 educational transfers from American church programs to unnamed overseas institutions between 1953 and 1989. No parental consent, no repatriation, no oversight. But that's just the top layer. A 2011 investigation into the Vitae Ascension Fund, a philanthropic front based in Luxembourg, discovered a consistent pattern of silent donations to trauma-informed youth facilities with religious affiliations. These same facilities had unexplainable losses in student population, often following large injections of cash. One location in Montana received $3.2 million in 2009 and 6 months later listed a reduction in student population by 17 with no public record of where those children went. 17. Gone. No news coverage, no police reports. Just silence purchased. Here's the truth. This is no longer a story about a church. It's a mechanism of elite preference, where children from desperate families become assets in spiritual laundering. Black market servitude, and private conditioning programs. When the wealthy want servants, they call recruiters. When they want disciples, they fund cults. And when they want silence, they write checks to God. Cedar Creek was the prototype. Today, it's scalable. Because when evil gets organized, it stops wearing horns. It starts wearing suits. And when you follow the money, when you dig deep enough, it always leads to the same truth. They were never trying to save the children. They were harvesting them. Cedar Creek was never just an American tragedy. It was a node in a global architecture. A small town cloaked in piety, used to test systems of removal, obedience, and silence. What happened there was replicated, refined, in corners of the world where oversight didn't exist and truth had no teeth. Let's follow the fracture lines. In 1952, a series of cultural exchange programs were launched between Methodist, Catholic, and Anglican churches in the US, UK, Belgium, and parts of Africa. They claimed to promote global understanding and Christian education, but the documentation, quietly unearthed in 1987, showed children were moved across borders without parental consent. Not for education, for indoctrination. Once overseas, children vanished into a network of resettlement academies. A phrase that sounds humane until you realize these academies operated under zero regulation, with no legal guardianship, and were funded by anonymous international trusts. Records linked dozens of these facilities to members of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, a Catholic knighthood with UN observer status and diplomatic immunity in over 100 countries. That's not just coincidence. That's design. In 1973, an intelligence dossier from the Dutch Interior Ministry, labeled Operation Clayvale, linked missing children from Protestant orphanages to private estates in Portugal and southern France. Estates owned by members of what researchers now call the Quiet Knights, an off-the-record order of nobility who fund and coordinate global, faith-based education. Among them minor royals, CEOs, church patriarchs. They operate through silence, through immunity, through sacred trust doctrines that protect missionary work from government interference. And when allegations arise, the children are labeled liars, the whistleblowers are branded possessed. The institutions, they disappear behind a paper fog of shell charities, offshore holdings, and vanished executives. But it gets darker. These programs didn't just displace children, they rewrote them. In dozens of recovered journals from facilities in Quebec, Nairobi, and Tuscany, former staff detailed spiritual resets, methods of breaking identity through isolation, ritual humiliation, chemical compliance, and forced religious hallucination. The goal wasn't labor, it was obliteration. And who funded this? The Vitae Ascension Fund, the Olam Renewal Trust, the Sanctum Group, each with directors who served on religious educational boards, humanitarian committees, and private wealth management firms. Faith, philanthropy, finance, all braided into a single cord used to pull children into the dark. One former Vatican archivist said it best before vanishing in 2006. You think these programs are about saving souls, but they're about erasing them until the child is gone and something else stands in their place. Something useful. This isn't folklore. This is the unredacted reality of religious geopolitics. Cedar Creek didn't die. It multiplied, under royal insignias, under NGO banners, under sacred vows. Because when institutions become immune from oversight, they don't purify. You've heard the phrase, mind control. So many times it's lost its weight. Sounds like science fiction, a trope. But inside the walls of Cedar Creek and the countless institutions that followed, it wasn't science fiction, it was policy. Ritualized, rehearsed, refined. What they did to those children wasn't just abuse, it was programming. Let me show you how it worked. They called it the ladder, a 7-stage system of psychological dismantling, copied, almost verbatim, from early Jesuit manuals on conversion and spiritual domination. But this wasn't about salvation, it was about submission. Control the mind, control the body, break the will, reshape the soul. Stage 1, isolation. New arrivals were cut off, from family, from their names, from their memories. Letters were intercepted. Language was forbidden. Silence was enforced for days, sometimes weeks, under the guise of spiritual fasting. Some children were forced to wear hoods for their first 7 days, not as punishment, but as rebirth. Stage 2, confession. They weren't asked to confess sins. They were told what their sins were, trained to believe they were broken, unworthy, cursed. Repeated chants before sleep. I was chosen because I was failing. This created false guilt. Once the guilt was internalized, obedience followed like gravity. Stage 3 punishment, not random beatings, scripted correction, suffering with meaning. Pain delivered with prayer, slaps became sermons. Flogging became atonement. One recovered manual described soul chains, a system where children carried small stones for every imagined sin, only allowed to drop one after a purification episode. Some wore these chains for months. Stage 4 reward. Once the child began to comply, affection was introduced, but always conditional. A kind word, a small meal, a hand on the shoulder. You're becoming useful, they'd say. And that word, useful, became their new name for good. Stage 5 transfer. The compliant were separated, moved to more elite quarters, given new names, sometimes even new birthdays. They were told they were being prepared for service. A phrase echoed across programs from Indiana to Ghana to rural France. But that service never meant education. It meant deployment. Stage 6 erasure. They burned photographs, destroyed birth records, cut hair, replaced accents, gave them new dialects, new scriptures, new truths. Parents who tried to reclaim them were told their child had moved on, or denounced their former identity. Those who resisted, labeled mentally unstable, institutionalized, forgotten. Stage 7 replication, the final stage. Some of the children, those most deeply programmed, weren't just victims. They became recruiters, re-implanted into new churches, new charities, new governments, tasked with finding others. They didn't know what they were doing. To them, it was faithful service. To the architects, it was supply replenishment. A 1971 internal memorandum from a Horizon-affiliated camp put it plainly: a cleansed mind is a vessel. Fill it with righteousness, and it will obey. Fill it with purpose, and it will convert others. This wasn't punishment for behavior. It was construction of identity, and the church was the factory. Let this settle in your bones. Cedar Creek wasn't a sanctuary. It was a mind furnace. A place where children were stripped down and recast into something useful, docile, and profitable. Because in the eyes of these institutions, the most dangerous thing a child could possess was their own will. Section 18 unearths the psychological legacy, the generational scars, the descendants still haunted, and the way these mind-forged chains echo in modern therapy, education, and even social media. Ready to face the aftermath? Scars don't just pass through blood. They pass through silence. The children who survived Cedar Creek, those few who escaped or were discarded, didn't go home whole. They carried damage that couldn't be named. And worse, they passed that damage on, not through stories, through behavior, through trauma, through echoes. Psychologists today call it intergenerational imprinting. But what we're talking about here is something more precise, more engineered, like a weapon that detonates across time. In 1993, a therapist in Illinois began compiling patterns from dozens of clients with no known connection. Yet nearly all shared the same symptoms: chronic dissociation, intrusive dreams of religious confinement, irrational fear of basement rooms, and recurring nightmares involving missing children and burning hymnals. They weren't making it up. DNA testing would later reveal that 7 of these patients were direct descendants of children enrolled in Cedar Creek's 1876 Sunday school program. People who never met, who never spoke, who didn't even know Cedar Creek existed. What lived inside them wasn't memory. It was programming residue. Because what Margaret Wilson and her successors did wasn't just physical. It was spiritual engineering. And once you carve that deeply into a soul, the wounds ripple. Across families, across generations, across cultures. You've seen these echoes. In parents who train their children to fear freedom. In teachers who glorify obedience over insight. In pastors who speak of God's love with the eyes of a warden. You think Cedar Creek was a place. Cedar Creek became a pattern, a code, passed invisibly through institutional rituals, through certain forms of worship, certain education styles, certain punishments that are still accepted as discipline in schools and youth programs today. The system doesn't just survive, it self-replicates. How? Language. When children are taught that silence is strength, that suffering is proof of holiness, that questioning is rebellion, you don't need chains. You've handed them the cage, and they lock themselves inside it. Guilt, the oldest lever of all. Taught young enough, guilt becomes a compass that always leads back to authority, even when that authority is the source of pain. Performance. Survivors become model citizens, overachievers, teachers, clergy. They rise in institutions that broke them, thinking obedience will cleanse the shame they never earned. This is the quiet power of the Cedar Creek Protocol. It hides inside the healed. And that's why so few ever speak, not because they forgot, but because they believe their trauma was earned, that they were the problem. That silence is holiness. Even today, descendants of survivors report, feeling watched, sensing rules no one taught them, dreaming of cold stone halls and disembodied sermons. Some write it off as religious anxiety. Others know better, because what happened in Cedar Creek didn't stay in Indiana. It reproduced in every institution that feeds on compliance and calls it salvation. Every time a child is told to sit down, be silent and suffer, for God, for school, for family, the spirit of Margaret Wilson flickers back to life. Not a ghost, a system. Even the most ancient systems, especially the ones powered by belief, run on schedules, calendars, ritual alignments. They need cycles to survive, to condition the mind, to keep the machinery of control disguised as tradition. Cedar Creek. It wasn't just random disappearances. There was a pattern, a calendar hidden beneath the hymnals and church bulletins. And it wasn't based on the Gregorian year. It was older. It was lunar. Researchers analyzing enrollment records, disappearance dates, and church event schedules found a disturbing consistency. Almost every child selected for excursions or educational travel left the church within a 3-day window surrounding a full moon, always after a night of reflection, always following something called the White Silence Gathering, a vigil service no longer acknowledged in Methodist history. And it wasn't just Cedar Creek. In orphanages across rural Ireland, in missionary schools in South Africa, in Baptist retreats from Tennessee to Oaxaca, children vanished around the same dates, under the same religious pretexts. The names changed, the renewal circle, the Feast of the Lamp, holy rotations, but the effect was identical. Children removed, records erased, consciences cleansed. Why the lunar cycle? Because these weren't random acts of evil. They were rituals of alignment, psychological and spiritual ceremonies designed to weaken resistance, amplify suggestibility, and mimic ancient rites cloaked beneath new symbols. Cedar Creek's programming wasn't invented in Indiana. It was a resurrection of forgotten systems, Roman, Babylonian, even pre-Christian. And Margaret Wilson, she didn't discover it. She inherited it. There are at least 4 handwritten calendars found among Wilson's effects, meticulously aligned with lunar phases, equinoxes, and feast days not officially recognized by any modern church. Marked in red ink were the departure nights. In blue, cleansing intervals. In black, a symbol, an open eye above a burning staircase. The same symbol carved into the basement beams beneath Cedar Creek's sanctuary. What does that tell us? This wasn't about theology. It was about timing, about sensing the trauma to specific energetic thresholds. The belief, ancient and persistent, is that trauma inflicted under the right celestial conditions doesn't just damage the body, though it binds the soul. That's why the children were taken then. That's why their identities were stripped under moonlight. That's why no trace was left, because these institutions weren't just covering crimes. They were conducting ceremonies. Even now, the remnants echo modern youth retreats scheduled around full moons, silence fasts, on vernal equinox weekends, churches that hold special vigils on nights with no scriptural precedent, only tradition. Watch them closely. The pattern's still running. And here's what should chill you. Every 19 years, the lunar cycle resets, a metonic recurrence known to ancient cults and calendrical priesthoods. Cedar Creek's last fire, 1878. The first reemergence of affiliated programs under a new name, 1897, then 1916, then 1935. It's a drumbeat beneath history, a secret rhythm, ticking, ticking. The deeper we dig into the Cedar Creek operation and its global descendants, the clearer one truth becomes: these systems never hid in shadows. They broadcasted their presence. You just didn't know the language. Every church connected to this network, every orphanage, every educational center, bore the same marks. Subtle, elegant, and utterly invisible to the uninitiated. Let me show you what to look for. Above the altar at Cedar Creek hung a stained glass window unlike any other in Methodist traditions, and an open staircase rising into a burning star. No cross, no Christ, just the ascent, a staircase leading toward illumination. At first glance, it looked like symbolism for spiritual growth. But that image dates back far earlier. It's a derivative of the ziggurat of Enlil, a Babylonian symbol representing the ascension of selected souls through trial by fire. This wasn't art, it was branding. The same staircase appears in frescoes inside the St. Aurelius School for Boys in Bavaria, closed in 1921 after 29 students went missing. It's embedded in the cornerstone of St. Lucia's retreat for girls in Portugal. It was printed on the leather hymnals used at First Mission of the Rising Path, a Louisiana church burned to the ground in 1962 after allegations of abuse. Always the same: a staircase, a flame, and a disembodied eye hovering above, sometimes crowned, sometimes weeping, a watcher, a judge. But it wasn't just art, it was placement. Cedar Creek's main chapel was built facing 331 degrees northwest, not true north. That angle perfectly aligns with the setting position of the dog star Sirius during the summer solstice in 1874, the year of the church's completion. Sirius, the same star used by ancient Egyptian priests to time temple rituals, the same watcher in the sky, invoked in Babylonian blood rites. Coincidence or invocation? Buried beneath the floorboards of the Sunday school room were engraved tiles, never meant to be seen. Tiles etched with a repeating pattern, circles within circles, 7 petals unfolding around a central void. This is not Christian symbology. It's found in Orphic cult sites, associated with rebirth through dismemberment and ritual silence. Every architectural choice was calculated. The narrow spiral staircase leading to the basement, designed to disorient. The acoustics of the chapel, engineered to echo whispers and muffle screams. The bell tower alignment, tuned to strike at specific moments of moonrise. Verified in 1978 by an acoustics engineer investigating residual phenomena at the ruins. This wasn't a house of worship. It was a chamber of resonance, a structure meant to amplify trauma, to confuse time, to collapse identity into suggestion. And now look at the world around you. Why does your local megachurch have labyrinths embedded in the floor? Why does a children's prayer garden in Kansas feature Roman pillars and spiral motifs lifted from Mithraic temples? Why do charity logos echo symbols once found in occult lodges, initiation chambers, mystery schools? Because the system didn't die, it evolved. And its symbols, like parasites, migrated into our churches, our schools, our charities, reframed, repackaged, but not changed. So next time you walk into a sanctuary, don't just listen to the sermon. Look up, look at the symbols, and ask yourself, who is this really for? It's happening again, right now. But this time, it's wearing new robes. It doesn't speak in scripture. It speaks in therapy talk, influencer mantras, startup culture, and school reform. The darkness that began in Cedar Creek didn't die. It adapted. It changed its face. Because institutions never bury effective control systems, they modernize them. Today, they don't need hoods and hymnals. They have behavioral frameworks, algorithmic feedback loops, and identity-first education models. What began in a stone basement in Indiana now echoes in corporate retreats, elite boarding schools, and even your child's YouTube algorithm. Let me show you the updated model. They call it character architecture, a new science of value-based personality design. You'll hear it in TED Talks. You'll read it in HR brochures. They speak of breaking down mental rigidity, reprogramming resistance, resetting core beliefs. Sound familiar? It's the latter again. But now it's digital. Now it's global. Now it's branded as personal growth. One of the most well-funded programs is called STAIR, Structured Thought Alignment for Identity Recalibration. It runs out of a corporate-affiliated youth success foundation in Virginia. On paper, it teaches discipline and purpose. In practice, it isolates, rebuilds, and deploys compliant children into partner institutions that control everything from education to social media access. Another, the AN Path Initiative, funded by a coalition of tech billionaires, former intelligence agents, and philanthropic religious leaders. Their motto, break the self, shape the future. They operate across 11 countries under the guise of educational acceleration, but insiders have leaked their internal materials. Structured, reflection silos, controlled emotional exposure, loss exercises, and symbolic renaming ceremonies eerily similar to those used at Cedar Creek. There's even a media training arm for young ambassadors, children selected for their social intelligence and charisma, groomed to promote higher discipline and community submission on TikTok and Instagram. These aren't influencers, they're vessels. And if you think that sounds insane, understand this: the algorithms support it. Engagement-driven content platforms reward the emotional rhythms of indoctrination. Spikes of fear relief, identity reward, just like the Cedar Creek ladder. Every click is data, every watch time a compliance score, every silence, every refusal to question is a win for the system. And who's funding all this? A familiar web, the Sanctum Group, now rebranded as a venture philanthropy firm. The Vitae Ascension Fund, now investing in neuroedtech. The Quiet Knights, still hidden behind shell trusts and cultural foundations. The same names, the same money, the same map. But here's the most dangerous part. They're framing it as salvation. Again, only now, they call it emotional intelligence, spiritual alignment, narrative healing. The words are softer, the results identical. And if we do not learn the structure of this machine, if we do not trace its roots from Cedar Creek's first vanished child to the sponsored content flooding your feed, we will raise a generation that no longer remembers what it feels like to be free. Because programming doesn't always come with chains. Sometimes it comes with a smile. Section 22 exposes the bloodline, those who profited, survived, and now occupy key positions in law, faith, media, and education. This isn't just about the past. It's about the people who made sure the machine kept running. Are you ready to name them? Behind every system of control, every rebranded cult, every disappearing child, every silenced whistleblower, there are people, not phantoms, not metaphors, bloodlines, descendants, families that fed off the machine and made sure it never ran dry. You want to find the architects? Follow the inheritors. The Cedar Creek operation wasn't buried. It was inherited. Profits didn't vanish with the church fire. They were laundered through banks, trusts, and philanthropic initiatives, launched by the very men who signed off on the disappearances. And their descendants, they didn't just survive, they thrived. Let's start with the name Hayes. Robert Hayes, the coal magnate who sat on Cedar Creek's church board, had 3 sons. One moved west, changed his name to Harlan Royce, and founded a Christian value school in Oregon that ran until 1981, shuttered after a sexual abuse scandal. The other 2, they stayed in Indiana. Their great-grandson, Daniel Royce Hayes, now sits on the board of an education technology conglomerate with contracts in 42 school districts across the Midwest. One of their platforms, a child behavior monitoring app used to detect spiritual compliance tendencies in students. Then there's the Winters family. Eleanor Winters was one of Margaret Wilson's private benefactors, a wealthy widow who funded the 1877 Sunday School expansion wing. Her estate established the Winters Institute for Youth Discipline, which after several rebrandings merged into what is now the National Youth Optimization Program, a nonprofit with deep ties to both corporate HR training and federal juvenile correction consulting. Guess who chairs that board? Dr. Emily Winters Klein, Ph.D. in Adaptive Behavioral Theology and keynote speaker at Global Child Development Summits. Publicly, she's a reformer. Privately, her lectures contain chilling phrases like, "The child's will must bend before the higher design." A sound familiar? Now look at Nathaniel Fordham, once a junior pastor at Cedar Creek, dismissed after an internal scandal. His lineage all but disappeared, until a document leak in 2016 revealed that the Fordham Circle Trust had been quietly purchasing abandoned religious properties across rural America for transformational youth retreats. No website, but no clear leadership. But the architectural plans, they match Cedar Creek almost exactly. Same alignment, same symbology, same staircase. Do you still think this is coincidence? We've tracked at least 17 separate families with direct ties to Cedar Creek who now lead or fund youth organizations, school programs, religious charities, or private education systems. Many changed names. Many cleaned records. But the fingerprints are still there, in tax documents, land deeds, inheritance transfers, and foundation charters. And what unites them? Silence. They've never spoken about their ancestors, never acknowledged the church's burning, never honored the missing children, because they know to admit the past is to unravel the present, and unraveling the present threatens the future they've been carefully, methodically designing for over a century. You were never meant to know these names, but now that you do, you've stepped across a line, and those who protect these systems don't forgive curiosity. They punish it, but trauma, real trauma, finds its own voice. And sometimes, it hides in the most innocent disguise. A children's book. Her name was Ellen Hartwell. She was 9 years old when she was taken on what was described as a missionary enrichment retreat. In the spring of 1877, her mother, recently widowed, had believed it was a blessing, an honor for Ellen to be chosen. But what followed would shatter every image of childhood, every memory, every sense of self. Ellen didn't just survive. She escaped. No one believed her story. Not then. not when she returned alone, barefoot months later, covered in scars and speaking in fragmented whispers. The town labeled her disturbed. The Methodist community disavowed her claims. Records of her enrollment were lost in the fire. Her name was scrubbed from every attendance log. For decades, she disappeared into silence. But Ellen didn't forget. In 1923, under the name Esther Dorrance, she published a strange, allegorical children's book titled The Stairs Beneath the Bell. It was marketed as a Christian fantasy tale and briefly appeared in Sunday school circuits before being abruptly pulled from shelves. No official explanation was ever given, but those who read it knew. Because The Stairs Beneath the Bell is not a story, it's a code. The plot: a young girl named Elka is taken from her village by white-robed shepherds to live in the Tower of Light, where she is told she's being trained for heaven's work. Inside the tower, the children are taught to forget their names, recite endless prayers, and walk in circles beneath a bell that never rings. Elka begins to remember, through fragments, through dreams, through a black-eyed bird that speaks in riddles and leads her into the hollow stairs beneath the chapel floor. There she finds names scratched into stone, 60 of them, children who stepped out of time. One page, illustrated with primitive drawings, shows a spiral staircase wrapped in fire, beneath an eye dripping ink. The same symbol found in Cedar Creek's ruins. Another shows Elka escaping by climbing downward, not up, through mud, shadow, and memory. And on the final page, she returns to her village only to find no one remembers her, not even her mother. The dedication: for those who never made it home. You are still walking the stairs, and I remember every one of you. That line was enough. By 1925, The Stairs Beneath the Bell was banned in 7 states. Church-affiliated bookstores were ordered to destroy remaining copies. The publisher, Soon Press, was acquired by a moral restoration group linked to the Winters family. All correspondence with Esther Dorrance vanished, but one copy survived. It was recovered in 1978 by a librarian in Ohio during the liquidation of a decommissioned orphanage library. That copy now sits, hidden from public view, in a restricted archive under lock and key at the Midwestern Institute of Religious Psychology. I've seen the scans, and let me tell you, Ellen Hartwell told everything. Every pattern, every ritual, every lie. She just wrapped it in fantasy, knowing full well what truth costs. Because when the system owns the language of history, myth becomes the last weapon of the silenced. Section 24 traces the final transmission. A set of coded letters Ellen buried beneath a chapel pew, unearthed by an archivist who paid the ultimate price for reading them aloud. Because the system always leaves one back door open until someone tries to use it. Shall we go deeper? And for Cedar Creek, that was Dr. Malcolm Dreyer, a quiet man, a historical archivist, and a former seminary dropout turned religious anthropologist. He wasn't a conspiracy theorist. He was a specialist in ritual architecture. And in 1992, while investigating the foundation stones of decommissioned chapels in Hamilton County, he found something he wasn't supposed to find. It was beneath a splintered oak pew in the ruins of a church long erased from official maps, known only in surviving ledgers as Second Light Sanctuary, a sister site to Cedar Creek. Dr. Dreyer had been tracing building layouts for a comparative study on religious acoustics when his crowbar struck something hollow beneath the pew supports. A rusted tin lockbox. Inside, 6 handwritten letters. Damp, smudged, barely legible, but real. They were signed E.H. and dated between 1907 and 1912. This was Ellen Hartwell's final testimony, a continuation of the story hidden in The Stairs Beneath the Bell, written in adult language with no metaphor, no allegory. Just truth. The letters describe her time in hiding, her observation of Methodist leadership across state lines, and most chillingly, her discovery of the new network being built on the ashes of the original. She names names. She lists towns. She describes a circle of chapels that share blueprints, schedules, and funding pipelines, still conducting selection nights during full moons under updated theological branding. She also mentions a phrase she said she overheard 3 times during her captivity, whispered by Sarah Coleman to another handler. Break the child, bind the gate. The Ellen believed the phrase referred to ritual trauma as a form of spiritual key, a way to open something. Not metaphorically, she meant it literally. She references an object known only as the seed, said to be buried, where fire did not burn, possibly beneath the original Cedar Creek chapel. What it was, she doesn't say, only that it was considered too potent to destroy and too sacred to trust to men. Dr. Dreyer, believing he had uncovered definitive proof of intergenerational abuse masked as theology, prepared to publish a paper titled The Bell, the Flame, and the Silence: Echoes of a Systemic Faith-Based Ritual Network in Rural Protestant America 1875-1935. He never made it to submission. 2 weeks after sending his abstract to a peer reviewer at the University of Minnesota, Dr. Dreyer was found dead in his apartment. No forced entry, no signs of struggle, and no note. His official cause of death: cardiac arrest due to stress-induced arrhythmia. But his brother, a retired electrical engineer, swore Malcolm had never had heart problems. And the night before his death, Dreyer left a voice message on his answering machine. "I think I've found the last doorway, Henry. If anything happens to me, tell them to read the 6th letter. It's all in there. It's always been in there." The 6th letter, Ellen's final message, has never been released to the public. It's reportedly sealed in a temperature-controlled archive under restricted access by the North American Society for Religious Psychiatry, a think tank with ties to the very institutions Ellen warned us about. No one outside the board has read it since, but rumors persist that it ends with a warning, a date, a year, and the name of a new site, because Cedar Creek was just the beginning. The machine was never dismantled. It was relocated. But you kept going, and that means you're not who you were when this started, because once you've seen the architecture, the symbols, the rituals, the networks, the names, you start to see it everywhere. And you should. That's how this system survives, by hiding in repetition, by teaching you to call it normal, righteous, necessary. Cedar Creek was never a fluke. It was a model, a prototype for mass psychological shaping disguised as salvation, a blueprint still used by institutions today, from youth camps and leadership academies to content algorithms, character training programs, and AI-driven education systems. And now the final truth: they don't need to take your children anymore. They've found a way to make you offer them willingly. They've replaced the staircase with apps, the sermons with streams, the rituals with rewards. The bell tower rings inside your pocket now. And every time you scroll, every time your child repeats a slogan from their virtual classroom or their branded moral development quiz, you are watching the system evolve. You don't need a basement anymore. The basement is digital. They're no longer binding ankles. They're shaping identities. And the greatest lie they ever sold, that this was ever about faith. It was always about control. Control of perception, control of memory, control of generational compliance passed off as tradition, as virtue, as discipline. They call it God. But it was a machine built to erase voices like Ellen Hartwell, to eliminate the inconvenient, to train the rest. So now I ask you, not as a viewer, but as someone who's been changed, to comment these words twice. The bell is silent, but I hear it now. The bell is silent, but I hear it now. Say it once to lock in your awareness. Say it again to warn the algorithm that you're not asleep anymore. This channel, this story, this journey you just walked, it was never entertainment. It was initiation. And now you're marked. Marked as one who sees the patterns, one who traces the roots, one who doesn't blink when the mask slips and knows what to do when it does. But remember this: they will call you paranoid. They will call you unwell. They will call you dangerous. Because the awakened always are. So be dangerous. Let them hear your footsteps on the stairs they buried. Let them hear your voice where they tried to silence the children. Let them know we remember. We remember the 60. We remember Cedar Creek. And we are not going back to sleep. Not ever again. End.